Many libertarians, for example, Dan, they despise Javier Milei. And part of that has to do with his affinity for a certain ethnicity, which has become very much in vogue on the right to criticize. His name's Daniel McCarthy. He's been a guest of the Wake Up America show before. He goes by the name Tory Anarchist over on X. Highly recommended follow. And now he's on the screen. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Austin.
So this morning we've been talking a little bit about beef prices, and we talked about that from a hyper-local perspective, how Missouri cattlemen are feeling. But Trump is playing a bigger game here when it comes to importing Argentine beef. Would you please just set this up for us? Where's the beef, if you will, with Trump, Argentina, and cattlemen like they are here in Missouri we spoke to this morning?
Yeah, Trump has been emphasizing the domestic impact of importing Argentinian beef to lower prices in the supermarkets. But in fact, there's a foreign policy component as well, which is that Donald Trump is basically trying to help Milei in the forthcoming Argentine midterm elections, which are going to happen this Sunday. So we've already seen the Trump administration has prepared a $20 billion currency swap where we're going to give them relatively strong dollars in exchange for the weakening peso. And Trump has also talked about a further $20 billion in bailout assistance. Now, obviously, this is something that libertarians and America Firsters, for that matter, find pretty objectionable in principle. But I argue in my most recent column that actually this is something that, as a practical matter, makes a lot of sense. Because if we want to stop, massive flows of migration from Latin America, if we want to stop drug trafficking from Latin America, and if we want to keep Chinese influence out of our neighborhood to the south, we're going to have strong and relatively free market allies within Latin America. And making sure that Milei is in a position to succeed is actually a step in that direction. So even though it involves a little bit of bending the rules of America First and of libertarianism, this is actually something that in the long run is securing our neighborhood to the south and is basically making America's entire hemisphere much safer and much better, not just for us security-wise, but also economically.
Dan, we could probably have a 2-hour summit to discuss all of the intricacies of the situation and where so many interests coincide when it comes to what's good for Argentina and what's good for the United States. Because there are a lot of people, America Firsters and libertarians, who, for whatever reason, they don't like Javier Milei. Some of them don't like it for cultural, ethnic reasons. Some of them don't like it for their principled reasons. Some of them say, well, that argument's not actually pragmatic because being America first every time, 100% of the time, is what we voted for, and it's what we deserve. So, and I can understand why people would be skeptical of this $40 billion currency swap with Argentina. Some people even call it election interference, if you will. But do you think that Trump has really divined the true path here, the golden path for all these chirping sectaries that we have on the right, as Russell Kirk might say? Do you think that Trump has really divined the true golden path for the United States in a way that helps everybody win, including the consumer who wants to pay, maybe not $10 for 90% lean beef?
Yeah, I think the big picture that Trump has drawn is the correct one. Now, think about this from the America First perspective. So there are people who basically, believe America First has to mean America alone. It has to mean America basically shutting off contact with a lot of its neighbors to the south, all of them perhaps, and that, we should not be interfering in their elections. We should not be interfering in whatever degree of stability they have or don't have. The trouble with that is that, of course, even if you want to think only about America's own territory, obviously you have to be concerned about mass migration. You have to be concerned about whether you have foreign interests, foreign superpowers, foreign communist superpowers like China getting involved in our neighborhood to the south. These have, tremendous security implications and economic implications, and ultimately political implications too, for us right here at home. So actually, if you want America to be able to conduct its own business in an America First way, you have to make sure that we don't have all these basically fires going on in our neighborhood. And anytime you have a socialist government or a left-wing Peronist government, which is what Argentina might eventually wind up with after Malay. If you have these left-wing governments, you're going to have such an economic basket case in these countries to our south that people are naturally going to leave those countries and try to come to the United States, legally or illegally. You're naturally going to have countries that are vulnerable to, or in fact eager to have, a communist China come to their rescue and provide them with bailouts. Now, I don't like it in principle that America has to provide lines of credit and other kinds of support for friendly countries to the south. But if we're not doing that, the Chinese will, and that's certainly going to increase their sway within our own hemisphere, which is definitely not something that's putting America first or putting liberty first, for that matter.
See, I think I agree with you, but that gets you called a neocon in the circles that I run in, Daniel McCarthy. When you make those kinds of realist foreign policy prescriptions, the chirping sectaries, specifically the isolationists, would argue that that intervention itself is not in America's interest and that it is better to every time follow the iron law of non-intervention, or for many people, and I think you've probably seen there really is a sort of a romanticism of a return to an isolationism. And I'm not saying that in the way that people who are using it pejoratively would, maybe during the Bush years and the Romney years and McCain years, but I'm using it rather descriptively because there really has been a return to a sort of Buchananite isolationism, especially among younger people, something to acknowledge, right?
Yeah, Pat Buchanan himself was never a pure isolationist. I mean, certainly during the Cold War, he was very supportive of our efforts against the Soviet Union. Actually, during the Cold War, Pat Buchanan also saw it as very important that America have Israel as an ally. So people here in the 21st century who are presenting Pat Buchanan as someone who believed that America would simply stay within its own borders and have no interest, no concerns, economically, strategically, or otherwise, beyond those borders, they basically have a false picture even of Pat Buchanan. It seems to me that, if you really want to prevent, a neocon push for regime change in places like Venezuela or Cuba, the best way to do that is to prevent circumstances like those in Venezuela and Cuba from arising in the first place. So to the greater extent that you have success for pro-American and free market elements within Latin America, the less opportunity there's going to be for socialists and communists to come to power, which is going to create less opportunity for neocons in our country to urge that we have to have regime change operations against a Maduro or against the communists in Cuba.
See, I knew that you're pretty much one of the only people that I can have a sane and sound conversation about these things, Daniel, because I've been making a lot of these same sounds that you have been making, but it feels as if, in terms of the chirping sectaries, those closest to my ideological viewpoint have really gotten themselves tied up into the foreign policy question and have really solely isolated themselves down to the question of Israel and Gaza and the Middle East. It feels like there's a bit of a hangover from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and a desire to look at neoconservatism and their failed project for a new American century and their desire to bring desire to bring an end to the conflicts in the Middle East. Have strayed strangely into what I would sort of say, again, almost Antifa level of Howard Zinn level of foreign policy, where it views this kind of, it has, like, American libertarianism has sort of adopted what I would consider to be something of a Howard Zinn view of history, where it's about oppressors and the United States and Israel are these oppressors. And they look at that because of the lens of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which were, failed neocon experiments for certain. But now it's as if we're looking at all of these new conflicts, like that's why it's always, everything is going to be World War III. But Trump finds the golden path, bombs Iran, allows Israel, allegedly, to bomb Doha, Qatar, the allies, the people that we're accepting planes with, and manages to bring hostages home. And yet the people that are closest to, perhaps, I say our ideological ilk, we're sort of somewhere on the branch of the same tree of conservatism, if you will, Daniel. But it feels like a lot of these chirping sectaries don't really know what time it is. Trump knows what time it is. Some of MAGA knows what time it is, but it doesn't seem like a lot of people who are closer on our branch of the tree seem to know what time it is, foreign policy wise. Am I divining this incorrectly? Are you seeing something I'm not seeing?
Well, you're exactly right. A lot of our friends view foreign policy through a kind of a priori lens, and it's a completely abstract picture for them. And there are certain inviolable rules which, they think as long as they follow, everything is going to turn out okay, which is not actually true. And sometimes, even if the rule is a good rule, it may not be something that you can actually follow in the circumstances that you're given. And now, Trump is a master of improvisation. I shouldn't say just improvisation, but he's a master of realizing what he has to do in a given set of circumstances in order to get the best possible outcome, which is not to say it's the best theoretical outcome, but it's the best outcome that can be had within the circumstances that we're actually dealing with. And he's been very, very successful at this time and time again. This was true during the first term. It's been true so far in the second term as well. Obviously, these are all very high stakes, initiatives that Donald Trump is undertaking, and there's a potential for them to go, upside down. So there's a risk, for example, that what he's doing with Argentina may actually tick off Argentinian voters who see, Yankees interfering in Argentinian politics, and maybe that's going to create a backlash against Milei. So there's room here to criticize on practical grounds or to say, prudentially, is this really going to work? But if you have this kind of just imaginative approach to foreign policy where you don't think that one of the weird things that's come to really bother me about libertarians, they understand correctly that there's a lot of evil in the United States federal government, and they understand that the state in the abstract can be a very, very bad thing, and usually is, but then they never apply that to other states. So it turns out that
God bless you, Dan McCarthy.
China, for example,
Blessings upon you. Blessings.
An actual communist state that puts people in camps, that this is not a worse thing than the U.S. federal government.
Dan, I need your address after the show so I can send you a Christmas card this year, because I've just been waiting for someone else with any credibility to say exactly what I've been saying and getting hell for it, because the libertarians really have so isolated themselves into their ideological bubble that they're incapable of seeing forest for trees. Many libertarians, for example, Dan, they despise Javier Milei. And part of that has to do with his affinity for a certain ethnicity, which has become very much in vogue on the right to criticize. Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene have really come out strongly against AIPAC. The Jewish question, it's certainly come up much more in our right-wing circles than it had. We used to have conversations back during the newsletter years about, at Murray Rothbard, not only did he march with the Maoists, but he also was a fan of David Duke, anything to overthrow the system. But now it seems, strangely enough, Dan, tell me if I'm going too far with this, but it's almost as if the right has adopted every crackpot libertarian conspiracy theory, but not a single one of our economic ideals or civil libertarian ideals. Is that going too far, or are you seeing this as well, or am I in my own bubble?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. I've been arguing that one reason why libertarians should be open-minded about Trump, and even if they disagree with him, they should just not write him off, and they should not write off MAGA, is precisely because if you do that, if you completely separate yourselves from MAGA and from Donald Trump, then you don't have a seat at the table, and you can't influence and make policies that you might find bad less bad. And instead, you're going to have people saying, well, look, the libertarians are aligned with the anti-colonialist, pro-Palestinian hardline left. We should completely not only ignore them, but basically do the opposite of anything that they say. And that's crazy. And also, I mean, again, just look at these foreign elements that so many libertarians sympathize with. There are plenty of criticisms you can make about Israel and about Netanyahu. Israel does, however, have a pretty robust free market economy. It's a stable country. It's a safe country. None of these things apply in an awful lot of, to a lot of Israel's neighbors. They're not free. Saudi Arabia is definitely not a free country. You can look at their economies, and oftentimes these are economies that are controlled either because the government has a monopoly on a single resource, or the government has other kinds of controls over its population, economically speaking. So I don't see why aligning with communist China or with Saudi Arabia or with terrorists in regions that don't even have any kind of law and order whatsoever, like Gaza. I don't see why that is more libertarian than saying, you know what, Israel might have its ups and downs, but actually this is more like a model for other countries than the alternatives that are out there. And of course,
so where's the derangement syndrome? I mean, so for example, Tucker Carlson used to be like the decider of what is mainstream and not mainstream on the right. And it seems as if now he's sort of flipped the script. He used to I was in Minnesota, for example, in 2008 with Ron Paul's rally for the Republic, when Tucker Carlson pissed us all off by leaving the convention in a huff because Jesse Ventura said 9/11 was an inside job on stage. Now he's regularly platforming those people, and sort of, 9/11 trutherism was kind of a libertarian thing until it became, an anti-Bush Republican thing. But now it's sort of strange because when I was talking about the conspiracies theories of the right, those were libertarian conspiracy theories, and now they're mainstream. But Tucker Carlson is also endorsing Elizabeth Warren's economic plan and suggesting that libertarians control everything in Washington, D.C., and then Candace Owens is just full on Jew hate. But I mean, there is a strange paranoia, conspiracy, conservatism that has become mainstreamed on the right. Are you seeing this as well? Or is Tucker still, in your mind, is he on the right path? Because I'm getting no end of hell by saying, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, I think with Tucker, what's happened is, he was deliberately being more mainstream than his actual views were back in 2008. So I was also at the Rally for the Republic. Tucker was actually a very strong Ron Paul supporter, especially philosophically. But, he was working for MSNBC at the time. He still had connections to the Weekly Standard, the neocon magazine that still existed. So Tucker was not really expressing exactly what his full views were back then. And I'm not saying that his views were aligned with Jesse Ventura's, but he was having to basically walk a tightrope and censor himself because he had mainstream media access. And I think what happened is that, once Fox fired him and got rid of him, Tucker felt like he should do the opposite of anything that he would have done back in his days working for the corporate media. And so, in a way, I think he's overcorrecting or over-responding to this change of circumstances. And he now says, look, if those guys were suppressing me when I was absolutely right about the Iraq War and absolutely right about Ron Paul, then maybe everything else they're suppressing is also worth entertaining or is worth examining. But that, of course, you can't simply take one thing that's 100% wrong and put a minus sign in front of it and invert it and say that everything that's exactly the opposite is going to be right. Because in fact, you wind up with, two completely crazy approaches. One of them being, kind of the mainstream, which embraces any sort of, stupid war and stupid growth of government. And then, on the other side, embracing too many conspiracy theories and anything that just kind of feels like it's sticking it to, the man in the mainstream media. So I would hope that, over time, Tucker kind of goes from overcorrecting and swinging too far in the opposite direction on this pendulum to maybe getting into, a balance. And he's got enough of an audience of his own that he doesn't have to do this. He can decide kind of how far he wants to go and how far he doesn't want to go. I think with Candace Owens, you probably do have, a case of someone who, just mentally speaking, is not on the same wavelength as normal people. And I don't mean that as, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not diagnosing here, but, she had this exchange even with Bill Maher where they were talking about the moon landing. And she says to Bill Maher, well, look, if we really landed on the moon, how come we never went back? And of course, normal people, including Bill Maher, who, I have my criticisms of Bill Maher, but he's just like, well, we did go back. We went back a lot of times.
Yeah, I tuned her out over a decade ago when she made an appearance and was talking about Hitler and nationalism. That was it just struck me as somebody who, got C's and D's in history class when they were growing up and now proceeds to lecture the rest of us on it. But I mean, social media fame is not connected to credibility when it comes to points of view. This is entertainment, except when you're watching the Wake Up America show and you actually get a little bit of substance and content on your crazy, silly, fun podcasts that we watch. But the podcasts have taken over. The inmates are sort of running the asylum, aren't they, Daniel? It used to, back in the day, MSNBC and Fox News would trim the hedges of people like Tucker Carlson or whoever would make it to mass millions of fame. But now any hobo with a smartphone can do a podcast and blow up online, right?
Yeah, and you can see why it's happening. It's because the mainstream media was so constrained and was so determined to put people in boxes or in terms of ideological orthodoxy that once the mainstream media lost its death grip on the nation's communications, you suddenly had a not just a Wild West environment but a kind of war of all against all, a very Hobbesian environment. So we've gone again from one extreme to the other, and I do blame the mainstream media for a lot of this precisely because they bottled up. I mean, during the Iraq War, for example, and you remember this, it was very hard for any kind of criticism whatsoever to get out there, and the mainstream media they even had this thing. interesting, and this is something I know that Pat Buchanan himself experienced. Buchanan actually had a platform on MSNBC of all places back then. And, he was getting called on the carpet by his bosses at the network who were telling him, look, we have you on our shows as a token Republican. And so we expect you to endorse the Republican line. And if President Bush, a Republican, is going to war, that means we expect you to support the war. And if you're criticizing the war, even if you're doing it for conservative reasons, we find that uncomfortable because, again, this is basically like pro wrestling. We have this as a staged fight where we expect the face and the heel. We expect people to have predictable views. We don't want to have a free and open-ended discussion where people are actually honestly questioning what's happening.
Daniel, you and I have known each other for years. We've always had really fascinating conversations. I read pretty much everything you put out to try and get an idea for where you're at. I think instinctually I'm still a libertarian, but I definitely identify with a lot of the goals that MAGA has. I've done my part to try and stake my claim in the libertarian movement with a form of what I think is a libertarian nationalism that's compatible with American ideals and at its heart still holds true to the ideas of Frederick Bastiat or Ludwig von Mises or Friedrich Hayek or many of the other, Henry Hazlitt or the Milton Friedman. But I definitely feel unmoored from what American libertarianism has become and feel very much thoroughly identified with Milleiism, who is very much pro-West. And I see just a very strong anti-West fervor coming from not just libertarians, but from people like, Tucker Carlson and others in the podcast sphere there's a very third world coded anti-American attack that feels like it's artificially happening. And I'm not big on conspiracy theories, but I do think that perhaps some of the malign influence on podcasters and on the media and some of these figures may come from certain Gulf states which have lots of money to spend here, but I don't want to go into the weeds there. I'd really just like to finish, Dan, with just kind of picking your brain as a Tory anarchist. Do you feel like when you and I first met, I think you were writing for the American Conservative perhaps, or you had just finished writing, please correct me if I'm wrong. But I'd like to just know where your brain is at these days. Are you just feeling kind of MAGA Trump these days? Or do you feel like there's a philosophical grounding that sort of describes yourself? Where are you out on the Nolan chart, paleo, conservative, neo? How are you feeling this? Or just plain pragmatic, Dan? How do you look at things? What lenses are you using to look at the world today?
I think there's been a lot of consistency. So again, back in the 1990s, when I was first getting interested in politics, I was very much a Pat Buchanan paleo conservative. In the early 2000s, when you had the George W. Bush administration in power, I was certainly very sympathetic to Ron Paul. And in fact, I worked for the 2008 Ron Paul campaign. I think there's a lot of truth in paleo libertarian critiques of the American state and of socialism in all its forms. So, I think there's still a lot of compatibility actually between paleoconservatism and paleo-libertarian. And obviously there are differences on things like trade. But the argument I've tried to make to my libertarian friends is, look, if you have these trade policies, which you find very dangerous and damaging, this means that you should actually go to your MAGA friends and say, okay, so since I'm saying this is going to be a really bad thing, if you want to have me in your coalition, and you should have me in your coalition, give me a trade-off. Let's lower taxes on all Americans so that we're offsetting, any kind of impact coming from tariffs, offsetting that by lowering taxes so that Americans have more dollars in their pocket to go out and consume. You can actually make a stronger libertarian case based on some of the non-libertarian things that MAGA and Donald Trump are doing. And it seems to me, there is a mix and a balance here. So yesterday I was on a British podcast, and I pointed out that even though the British people were talking about, how MAGA is a bit more statist and maybe more socialist, I pointed out that actually if you look at red states, the states that Republicans control, they are much freer and it's much easier to start a business, and they are much healthier as a result. So it's not even the case that the Republican Party has, gone in a completely statist populist direction, or libertarians might say a socialist direction. It's a mixture. You have tariffs at the national level, but actually that is protecting, or that is helping to create conditions in which Republicans can still be extremely free market and pro-business, and pro-starting new businesses, which is the vital thing at the state level in places like Florida and Texas.
Yeah, honestly, Daniel, I know that this is going to sound perhaps overly sentimental, but hearing you say these things gives me a lot of hope personally, because I've really felt lost in the wilderness in some ways in the last several years, just because of where the Tea Parties had left us and MAGA had taken over, and a strong anti-libertarian streak that has risen up amongst young people. They're skipping their libertarian phase and they're going straight to Heil Hitler, which I recommend against. So, Dan, is there anything else you want to share with our audience before we let you go? Is there anything you'd like to plug? This is your opportunity. We've got a nice audience size, so please do share anything that you'd like.
Yeah, in addition to my syndicated column, which comes out from Creator Syndicate, and you can find that at the New York Post, you can find it at Chronicles Magazine and many other fine publications. I'm also the editor of a quarterly journal called Modern Age, and its website is www.modernAgeJournal.com.
That's great. Dan, hey, thanks so much. Please keep up the great work, and thank you so much for pinging me with the email about the article you wrote about Javier Milei. I guess we've got a lot to look forward to. His elections, now we're all invested, so like it or not, on the 26th, we better hope he wins. Have a good one, Dan.
So. Thanks.